guys, and I was gonna make you sift through it.
Why would you do that?
Because I live for a little bit of chaos. No, I re-recorded it.
If the video was 6 hours and I had to watch it, I wouldn't watch it.
I'd be really disappointed if you did.
Just have it go on overnight.
Mr. Wells, I watched all 6 hours of your video, and all I would say is why.
I would just like sit there and do other homework until I just run overnight and not listen.
Ooh, crap. With what looks like a plant on it.
No! Well, to be fair, there were a lot of people knocked off yesterday. So we'll see what we got. My physical science is actually almost back to full strength.
Is this all we have?
No, I think there's a few that have conflicts. Quite a few people at home today. What have we got on this list? Ian, Bryce, Victor, Ethan Greener, Erica, this one's not on there. Bobby, he's got a conflict with that. Rogan's here. Michaela, not online. Eric, not online. Who's there? Charles is here. Eric is online. Danielle's here. Charlie is here. Victor is online. Emily, I know I've seen today. Yeah, she'll figure it out pretty quick. Liv. Usually she's here early. Savion has conflict. Bailey's not online. And it's here. Samantha. She's got a conflict. Let's see who shows up and how it goes. Kind of bums me. Like, I like to learn anywhere, but at the same point, some of these conversations that I have are a lot more entertaining when there's a lot of people here. You know, people ask questions that are like very useful to the conversation, and then I can really get into that.
And nobody wants to talk on there.
No one wants to talk on that.
Some people are just going down there to get their attendance.
Yeah.
And going to bed.
There's that too. Which, whatever, I guess. To each their own. So today's kind of my favorite conversation we have in ecology. All about social relationships and how they develop in an ecosystem and the evolution that takes place between them and how intricate they are and how interdependent they are. So I'm going to give you a lot of examples of different social relationships that occur, and each of them are very unique and they're all very different. You're going to see a lot of cool things you probably have never seen before. This is one such case where we have a crab having a symbiotic relationship with not a plant, but an anemone. The anemone provides protection for the crab. The anemone also, or the crab gets protection. The anemone gets a food source because the scraps from the crab float up into the anemone, so they can get food that way. It's also kind of cool because now this anemone has mobile transportation that it's never had before. So that's pretty unique and a very cool way where two organisms are living side by side, interdependent upon each other. that results into a mutual benefit. Really, really cool. And surprisingly beautiful. There's something beautiful about that, at least for me, I think. So social relationships today. So the first big, most important social relationship is symbiosis. A short, long-term interaction between two organisms, or it could be sometimes more organisms than that, but two or more, a way to obtain food or protection, and there's kind of three main types. So anytime we have two organisms interacting at some level, we can classify that as a different type of symbiosis. There are three main types. We can break it down into a way, or many, many more different types as well, but we're just going to focus on three. If we look at the hippo, what are the fish, those carp, doing for the hippo? What does it look like the fish might be doing? Cleaning its mouth. Hippos don't exactly have the most clean mouths in the world. They have a lot of crevices that food and other particles can easily get caught into, which lead to infections, and infection leads to death in the animal kingdom. So these fish are providing the hippo a resource or protection, a net or a nature dentist office, if you will. And then the hippo in return, one, doesn't eat the fish, and two, the fish get a food source from those particles in the hippo's mouth. If we think about a sleeping lion and the little tiny lizard in front of it, the lizard is eating a selection of flies that are a nuisance or even a parasite for the lion. So lion not being parasitized is pretty dang good, and not being bugged by flies. And then the lizard itself gets a food source. So it all works out pretty well. Now, not all of these symbiotic relationships do both organisms benefit. In fact, most of the time they don't. Most of the time one is either harmed or another, or just is kind of there. It doesn't negatively affect one or the other. They just kind of live in close proximity to each other. So here is one example of a symbiosis that I find very intriguing. That would be a symbiotic relationship, yeah, sure.
In the canopy. New life competes for this light, like this vine racing this sapling upward. But there's one tree that never has any competition, thanks to an incredible symbiotic relationship it shares with an ant. The swollen thorn acacia and its namesake, the acacia ant, have developed harmonious roles in each other's lives. The ant role is as protector. If any of those vines try to steal the acacia's life, the ant security guards go to work. A few good chomps on the vine stems, and it lights out for the vine. The ants don't stop there. This relatively huge grasshopper may think it's going to take a few bites out of the non-poisonous acacia, but the ants take a few bites out of it instead. And they throw in a few stings for good measure. In exchange for all this protection, the tree takes on the provider role. It gives the insect everything it needs in terms of food and shelter. These little nodules, or nectaries, secrete a sweet nectar for the adult ants to eat. And these brownish pods at the end of some leaves are a perfect nutrient-packed food for the ants developing young, called larvae. The acacia ant larvae live down hollowed-out thorns at the base of the acacia leaves. Some will eventually grow into adults with wings and will fly off to replicate this evolutionary masterpiece in a new acacia.
So what are some things you noticed in this video? Who are the main characters
Ants.
in this plot? Ants and the acacia tree. The acacia tree.
That's a orange tree in Minecraft.
The acacia tree is actually a wide range of trees that can be found across the globe. They're highly successful, actually. How does the ant benefit from the acacia tree? Food source, shelter.
Protection for the young.
The entire life of the ant in this situation is built around the acacia tree. The acacia has thorns that the ants are able to protect their young in. The acacia tree secretes a sugary solution that the ants then consume and provides a habitat. What does the acacia tree get out of the ant?
When a new one is formed.
Huh?
When a new acacia tree is formed.
So when the new acacia tree grows, there are new ants that come up.
It stops the vines from.
Right. So in the rainforest, the hottest commodity is space, is sunlight, is access to the sun. And you lose that access very quickly, particularly if you don't grow super fast. So these ants have evolved to provide space for the slow-growing acacia tree by any vines that attach itself to it. Any trees that start to invade on the acacia tree space, the ants will go to war on it and start attacking it, cut it down to make sure that that tree has its own space, access to sunlight, which is so vitally important in this particular ecosystem. No.
Whenever a huge tree falls in the Costa Rican rainforest, a gap of sunlight is.
So this jumps into our first. Why can I never hide that span? The first kind of main category, which is super important to any ecosystem, is mutualism, where we have two or more organisms interacting in close proximity, and both individuals have some sort of benefit that they gain from the situation. They increase in fitness. So when they're in the presence of each other, their ability to survive and reproduce is increased. Now, with this, there are trade-offs. Mutualisms aren't all sunshine and rainbows. There are trade-offs. Like if we look at this top right image, we have a shrimp that survives and lives within the inside of a deep sea coral. The shrimp can never leave that habitat inside that coral. It swims in as a larva, it grows in there, it survives in there, but it gets so big that it can never leave because the pathways, the pores in that coral are too small, and it ends up entombing itself inside of this coral. Now, it's still a mutualistic relationship because the shrimp gets protection. Nothing can get to it unless it were to eat the whole coral. And the shrimp gets food sources as well because there's food that flows in through the coral. The coral gets a cleaning crew, a built-in cleaning crew that is super successful to the fitness and survival of these corals. Another obvious one that everyone kind of knows about is the relationship between a starfish, a clownfish, and a sea anemone. Clownfish protect the anemone, they clean the anemone, and then the clownfish gets protection from the anemone as well. Being it's a super small fish. Super, super important in this situation. Any mutualisms that you could think about in your backyard at home, maybe in your house that you have.
Shelter.
Your house isn't alive. Anyone got pets? Pets are in mutualistic relationships that have developed between humankind and whatever animal you have. Humans get emotional support. Very, very important for the health of most of us. The animal gets emotional support as well. Food, shelter, protection. If we were to think about you can think of a bald eagle. Bald eagles like to build nests in large, massive trees. That would kind of be an example of a mutualism between a tree and the bald eagle. The bald eagle gets a place to build its trees, and then the tree itself gets protection from the bald eagle as a top predator. Not a lot of stuff is going to go near a tree that has a bald eagle's nest for its own safety. Here's another one. If you ever see this flower in the jungle or in the forest run,
almost 60 centimeters high, this is the immense flower of Eucalyptus. Locals call it the witch of the forest.
properly named.
As the stars rise, the witch begins to cast her spell. The forest temperature drops, but the flower starts to heat up. A heat-sensitive camera reveals the flower's temperature rising by an incredible 10 degrees Celsius. At the same time, a noxious stench of rotting flesh fills the forest air. As the flower's heat increases, a cloud of odor rises up. The foul perfume carries far and wide. It doesn't go unnoticed. Carrion beetles arrive on the scene. The beetles come in search of a feast of warm, decaying flesh. But they've been tricked. Slippery sides ensure they tumble straight into the center of the monster flower. There's not enough room to spread their wings, and the waxy walls ensure that there's no escape. But there's nothing sinister in the flower's agenda. The beetles will be its unwitting helpers. Dawn arrives, but the flower remains unchanged, holding its captives through the day. As the second night falls, the witch stirs again. In a matter of minutes, the flower's precious golden pollen squeezes from the stamens and begins to fall, showering onto the captive beetles below. Now, at last, the prisoners are free to go. The flower's wall changes texture, becoming rough, to provide the ideal escape ladder. Loaded with their pollen parcels, they can now climb to freedom, just as other forest witches are beginning to open. Seduced by the irresistible perfume, the beetles are sure to pay a visit, so ensuring pollination and another generation of incredibly big, smelly flowers.
So the witch of the forest. It's actually the largest flowers in the world. Don't smell pretty. They smell like rotting flesh. So it's kind of interesting. It's not as simple as that, because these flowers, a lot of them only bloom like once every 7 years. So sometimes it's going to be very hard to actually find them, let alone be able to grow them and then put them kindly into somebody's room for like a Valentine's Day. 7 years. This one is a little bit different than the situation we saw before. Why? Did both organisms benefit in this situation? No. No. The flower is the only one that benefits. The beetle just kind of, gets trapped, stuck, ends up being the delivery boy for the smelly, stinky flower. So the smell of rotting flesh brings in the carrion beetles, different flies, that then get stuck inside the flower because the flower walls are slimy and they can't climb up and out, so they're stuck there. And then once the pollen has been released, the texture of the flower changes and acts as a ladder, and they climb on out. And then being that they're beetles, they're not smart enough to realize that the flowers are doing this sadistic torment to them. But they repeat this process, and they go to the other witch of the forest flowers, and they pollinate them, and the cycle continues. I'm a pretty loud person. It is okay. But yeah, smelliest flowers in the world are also the largest ones. So here we have commensalism, a symbiotic relationship that has evolved where one organism benefits, the other one is indifferent or doesn't even acknowledge the situation that's happening. It doesn't negatively affect them at all. They don't increase their fitness, they don't decrease it. They're just there. So one benefits, one does not. My dog owning people. Whole bunch of burrs in a dog. Does the dog really get hurt by the burrs? Not really. Not unless they really dive head first into a pile of burrs, and now it starts clogging up their skin, and then they have the fur that they got to get it shaved off to actually get it out. That's a pain. But in general, the burrs don't harm the animal in any way. They're just used as a primary carrying source, taking advantage of the dog, but not hurting the dog. Almost every whale species you will ever see, particularly the larger ones that tend to be krills and are slow-moving, the blue whales, the humpback whales, the right whales, bonehead whales, all of them, you will find a colony of barnacles growing on the mouths of these animals. They don't negatively harm the whales, but the barnacles get free mobile transportation and access to a primary food source. They can filter feed right on that whale. Doesn't harm the whale, at least not most cases. Sometimes it could, but for the most part, no. Whale doesn't even acknowledge that they're there. But the barnacle gets a great benefit in this situation. We think about where we live in western Wisconsin. Any examples of a commensalistic relationship that come to mind? Where one organism might benefit or has some sort of benefit, while the other is not harmed, but not benefited in any way. Yeah.
Moss on a tree.
Moss on a tree. Moss gets a benefit, gets prime real estate. Tree doesn't get harmed in any way. It's not blocking the photosynthesis of the tree. It doesn't really affect the bark of that tree too much. But moss gets a benefit, sure. I was watching a video the other day about what to do if you get swallowed by a whale, how to survive. Because this actually, there was a photographer for National Geographic, I think, that was in this situation where he was in a bunch of feeding the blue whale, or I think it was feeding humpback whales. And he just happened to be right in the line of a humpback whale opening its mouth and got stuck in there. But the whales are nice enough to spit you back out. They push you out with your tongue. So he ended up being fine, but just kind of an interesting story about whales.
Was it a video?
Yeah. And there's actually only one species of whale that can actually swallow you. Like blue whales only have an esophagus that's like 20 centimeters or so, about like that. A sperm whale is the only whale that can theoretically actually swallow and consume a human. All other whales, their esophaguses are so small that they couldn't actually fit us down their esophagus. Sperm whales, it's more about their food source. Being that they're the largest toothed whale, and they consume giant squid and larger predatory or larger animals, they need the larger esophagus. Versus blue whales, gray whales, any whale that consumes primarily krill or algae, they're consuming organisms that are super, super tiny. So they don't actually need a huge esophagus at all. Just kind of a cool thought. This one's a little bit gross, so if you're a little squeamish, be prepared. This is the coolest of all of the symbiotic relationships. And the most interesting.
Our parasitized caterpillar has spent the last 12 days gorging itself. It now appears profoundly obese. But this is not all fact.
No, I did.
The Glomerata wasp larvae lie just under its skin. Each is the size of a grain of rice, but together they account for over a third of the caterpillar's weight. The larvae have not yet finished growing and need to keep their host alive. So although they feast on the caterpillar's blood, they have been careful not to touch a single one of its vital organs. This uneasy truce will not last. Within days, the larvae are fully matured. Suddenly, they begin to stir into action. For the past 2 weeks, this surrogate womb has protected them, but now they no longer need it. To complete the next stage of their life cycle, they must break out. The caterpillar's thick skin should be a solid barrier to the parasitic wasp larvae. But as their bodies have grown, they have developed tiny, saw-like teeth. These jagged jaws are for one job only: cutting their way out. Stroke by stroke, the larvae slice through the tough layers of skin. At the same time, they release chemicals that paralyze the caterpillar. As the larvae break through, there is nothing it can do. Free at last, the larvae enter a new phase of development. They swiftly spin silken cocoons. These will provide the perfect environment for their final transformation. But ironically, one of the greatest dangers the larvae will face is being themselves impregnated by other species of parasitic wasp. Incredibly, the wounded caterpillar helps them out. Usually, a caterpillar would spin a silken blanket to make its own cocoon. But the parasitized caterpillar spins his blanket on top of the wasp cocoons, giving them an extra layer of protection. Scientists believe the same wasp virus that infected it weeks before has now invaded the caterpillar's brain and caused this bizarre corruption of its normal behavior. Amazingly, the caterpillar's natural aggression is now also exploited by the wasp virus. The caterpillar becomes a bodyguard, actively protecting the cocoons from other parasites. It will watch over them unceasingly until it eventually starves to death.
Emotions, thoughts.
Wasn't it paralyzed though?
So the wasps, the wasp larvae did leave a neurotoxin while exiting the caterpillar body that results in paralysis, but the paralysis wears off after a little bit once the wasp or the larvae have actually exited the body. That's a good set of emotions for this. Any other thoughts or emotions? Yeah. It's very beautiful and terrifying all at the same time. Parasitic relationships in nature are so intense because it's a constant battle for an advantage between the two organisms involved in the parasitic relationship. So just when the parasite thinks it gets a step up, the host of the parasite ends up evolving to outcompete that parasite. And then when the host makes that step, the parasite quickly makes that step to catch up to it, and it's a constant arms race. It's basically the Cold War of nature. Just when one gets an advantage over the other evolves to meet the rising need or the rising evolution of whatever the host is. So there's no real escape. We can see parasitic relationships take all types of forms. You can see it as a bug replacing the tongue of a fish by cutting the blood supply of the fish's tongue off, and then it replaces the tongue and forever survives in the mouth of the fish, eating parts of whatever that fish eats. Harming the fish, being the fish that can't actually get rid of it anyway, is stuck with it. Plants can be parasitic. So here we have an example of a plant that actually has attached itself to the canopy of a rainforest tree. Its root system actually grows into the tree and it steals the nutrients of the tree, but also has a nice spot to get a lot of sun. And then you also have your typical heartworms and your flukes and your tapeworms. Anyone wondered why people never get dewormed? I was thinking, like, my puppy is just going to his third vet and is getting his last set of vaccinations today. But every month we have to give it a D-heartwormer and D heartwormer and a dewormer. Like, I know people ever need to get dewormed. I know we cook our food, so that more or less helps. But there's always that little bit of gray area where it's like, who likes to keep their meat a little bit on the red side? Yeah, so like I like to eat my meat a little bit more raw than some might. And I'm like, wouldn't it be good to have like a yearly deworming for people? So you don't get infested with a whole bunch of unwanted parasites? What are some examples of parasites we experience in our lives? Tapeworms. Tapeworms are very unique because there's like an own independent tapeworm for each species that it inhabits. So there's a human tapeworm, there's a cow tapeworm, there are deer tapeworms, and they always infect those specific species. You don't usually find a cow tapeworm inside of people. It's very unique. They are evolved to be a parasite in a specific host. Charles? Lice. Another great example of a parasite that we've probably all been affected by at some point. They're little bloodsuckers, live in your hair. They can jump like incredible distances. Fleas, ticks, mosquitoes, they're the worst. I love almost all animals except for mosquitoes. Unfortunately, without mosquitoes, most ecosystems would collapse because they're a vital portion or a vital food source to any ecosystem. That would be super helpful.
Maybe she'll just learn to like drink animal blood.
Well, the good news about mosquitoes is the males don't actually bite anybody. The females are the only part of the organ, or the portion of mosquitoes that actually consume blood to feed their young. Males are actually pollinators. Yeah. The males of mosquitoes are actually pretty beneficial. The female mosquitoes are just jerks. And then there goes bat populations and everything collapses about mosquitoes. It's,
Bats are cute.
huh?
Bats are cute.
Bats are very beautiful in their own way.
Are you saying you don't like bats, Mr. Wells?
I love bats, but they're greatly misunderstood.
Yeah.
I had to deal in college. One of the houses I lived in had a bat problem. So and my other two roommates and my now wife are wimps, and they couldn't deal with bats whenever a bat came in. So I'd be in the middle of class. I'd get a call. There's a bat in the house. So as soon as I was done with class, I just sprint home, grab my fishing net, catch it, have my thick rawhide gloves so they couldn't bite you through it, and take it outside. Fun part of college life.
Should we get a class bat?
I think it would be, they're an endangered species, so it would probably be, you have to have a special license to actually have it. So those are the main three: mutualisms, commensalisms, parasitisms. You get predation and other stuff that plays a role, but those are the kind of the main three I wanted to talk about. Now you get into evolution driven by mate selection. Like I talked about last week, the unnecessary size of a peacock's feathers with trade-offs. The unnecessary size of moose's antlers, of a select group of birds called birds of paradise that live in Indonesia. And then guppies and some species of ants have a big role here. This is driven by sexual selection. So this is where the right to mate, to reproduce, is the most important decisive factor in the evolution of particularly male species of male members of a species. Birds, in a lot of cases mammals, are greatly affected by this. In almost all bird species, the males usually are what?
Colorful.
Colorful. Compared to the females,
Brown.
females are usually brown, pretty dull. They don't have to impress anybody, they're females. They get to drive the whole process. If the female doesn't like you, you don't reproduce. Your genetics don't get passed on to the next generation.
The ultimate scorn. No more genetics.
Sexual selection. Bighorn sheep. Massive horns, typically the sheep with the largest horns, same with white-tailed deer, same with moose, elk, male with the largest horns, tend to be the ones that reproduce the most, so their genetics get passed on, and their offspring have larger horns or antlers. Trade off with a bighorn sheep, or any sheep that grow these big elongated horns that spiral. Sometimes they grow large enough or long enough that they actually impale the male and it grows through their skull. Sometimes.
And it kills them.
And it kills them. Because their trait is completely unnecessary beyond the need to reproduce. A male pheasant, is it very good at hiding? Is its camouflage very good? No! It's crap camouflage. It's only good for attracting a mate. When it really comes down to it, that's the most important thing, is passing on your genetics. You guys know that pheasants are an invasive species, right?
No.
They're not native to the U.S. They're an invasive species. They were brought here for the sole purpose of hunting.
So should we kill them all?
Technically, yes. The prairie chicken, there's the lesser and the greater prairie chicken. Those were our native bird species that fill the same niche or role that pheasants do. But because there's pheasants, they kind of have pushed the greater prairie chicken to close to extinction. There are a few populations of them remaining, one by Stevens Point, one by Prairie du Chien, and a couple in Iowa. Very, very beautiful birds, and I will bring them back up later as we get closer to the end of the semester. Main driven point here with sexual selection, we get extremes that shouldn't normally happen, but because it's all about mate selection and reproducing the most, you get some unique traits. Now, there's two types of sexual selection that you see. There's intrasexual selection, where it's competition between the same sex of a species. So in this case, it's not necessarily the female determining who gets to reproduce. It's more of the actual fighting between the males, or the fighting between the females. So if you're a whitetail hunter or a moose hunter or an elk hunter, it's prime rut right now, which means that it's reproduction time. The males are constantly fighting between themselves, bashing each other in the head with their grotesque antlers, their large antlers, and normally the winner gets to reproduce. Sometimes you get the sneaky deer that while there's two males fighting, will sneak in and breed the doe while the other two are fighting. That's like ha ha ha. Seen it happen. It's kind of funny. You also see female fighting. This is kind of more common in like fish species, where the females tend to be larger. They determine, and males are much smaller. There's fewer males, there's more females. So the females have to fight for the right to mate with those males. So intrasexual, meaning between the same sex of the species. Have you guys ever seen how long the claws are on a kangaroo?
No.
Like that long. They're like Jurassic Park Velociraptor claw long. I don't remember if I told you guys this, but I told the other class. Kangaroos are very violent. If they're being chased by a predator, kangaroos have a tendency to run into a river or a lake. The predator comes after them, and being that the kangaroo is bipedal, meaning it walks on both legs, they use their arms and drown the predator.
Oh.
So there's a lot of Australians that tend to lose dogs because dogs will chase the kangaroos. The kangaroos will go into a river, and they drown the dog by forcing it down.
Just don't, if you look in Australia, don't have pets.
Don't just live in Australia. Bobby.
They've got spiders inside everything.
Kangaroos, they're kind of, you can almost argue like the Hannibal Lecters of nature. They're very cruel. And then you have the intrasexual selection, where the female ultimately determines who reproduces and who doesn't. The female there's no fighting between males. The female decides. This is pretty common in birds, in reptiles as well. They'll have some sort of dance that the male does. They'll have some extra plumage. They maybe make a special sound that calls the female to them. They have some sort of display that they use to gain the affections of the female. And then once they have it, then they can actually reproduce. But there's no actual fighting taking place between the male and male of the species. It's all based on, well, the female doesn't like my dancing display, So that female moves on, and that male doesn't reproduce. If the female likes your dance, likes your color patterns, likes the song that you're singing, then you get to reproduce, because it's related to the better your dance is, the prettier you are, the higher fitness you are, the better your genetics are, the better our offspring are going to be. All about that strength. I'm pretty sure that is it. So tomorrow, we will go to the river because it's supposed to be really nice. So make sure that you are in class tomorrow. You check in like we did before. And then we'll go down to the river. We'll carpool like we did. And we're going to be looking at the chemical analysis of the river. And then we'll probably do some organism collection while we're down there as well. So we'll have the nets. And then I think Friday's supposed to be really nice as well. So I think I'm going to find a lab that we can do outside for that. So we can get outside again and enjoy the nice weather before it turns into winter. Have a good rest of your day. We will see you tomorrow.
Well, I enjoyed how passionate talking about how
Bye, Mr. Wells.
Bye.
very passionate when you're talking about the whole sexual stuff about the
It's